What's up, Whappers, and welcome into this distance learning edition of the ATW. I'm going to be continuing to do ATWs throughout the process, as well as starting tomorrow, we're going to begin to do online office hours. I'll give you more details on that. You may be wondering, what's up with the outfit here? Well, if the COVID-19 virus had not turned into a pandemic, today would have been opening day for Major League Baseball, so that is why I'm decked out in Mets gear today. But aside from the boyhood dreams of playing right field for the New York Mets, the other dream in life was to be a history teacher. Let's do that today with our ATW. And the aim of the ATW today is mostly to strengthen your reading comprehension of the textbook readings that I assigned for this week one packet. And keep in mind with the due date on the packet, the admin sent out lots of literature about this. There's a soft due date for that on next Tuesday, March 31st. For the writing, that's for practice. Just practice the writing. Keep sharp on these days off until we get back into the grind with our classes going online in the near future. And for the reading, it's about content because, as I mentioned the other day in the intro video, the content for the AP is shrunk. It's been reduced now to just periods 1 through 6, which is, we are on the last part of that unit 6, which is the theme of imperialism. The good news is that there's a lot of opportunities, and you'll notice in the read for discussion questions that I gave you guys to work on. I'm really emphasizing compare and contrast as well as continuity, change over time skills, because when it comes to imperialism in the 19th centuries, that's the 1800s, we're dealing with a continuity in that the Europeans would once again go around the world, plant their flags on foreign soil and dominate the world due to their military and now their industrial might. And I'm going to give you a phrase here that I want you to think about whenever you're looking at imperialism in the 19th century and throughout the 1800s. If you don't industrialize, you get imperialized. And conversely, if you want to imperialize, then you must industrialize. There is a direct relationship between the ability to build factories, the ability to turn your society into an industrial society, which we spent a lot of time before the COVID break talking about industrialism and the Industrial Revolution. And so countries throughout Europe and, of course, the United States, let's not forget about the United States, countries throughout the United States and Europe really became industrial powers. The next step, the next layer to industrialism was the ability to go out and conquer and build overseas colonies, just like the Europeans had done in the 15, 16, and 1700s. What's the major difference and change over time now, though, is one, you have the Americans involved. The United States will play a direct role in imperialism. They will go out and imperialize territories, mostly in South and Central America, as well as Asia, with Southeast Asia with the Philippines. But other European countries are going to get deeply involved in imperialism. And what we're going to do here today is sort of talk about the areas in which European powers were becoming imperialized. And then I'm going to kind of give you a preview for what the later part of the reading packet dealt with, which is the response of various peoples to becoming imperialized. And so, again, the motivations to imperialize and to conquer really go back to, that's a continuity in and of itself, because you still have the same ideas are, oh, there goes my poster off the wall. I'm just going to keep going. Well, there we go. This is distance learning at its best, and I'm just going to keep this thing rolling. So, like the poster on the wall, various colonies around the world began to fall under the pressure and power of the Americans and Europeans, and the raw materials and the desire for raw materials and goods still is that continuity. That was what was driving the motivation for European and American governments to secure colonies overseas. The only difference over time would be the fact that new raw materials were now more desired in the 19th century than before. Raw materials such as tin, rubber, steel, different goods and foods are still there as well. But because the world is more industrialized now, iron, steel, coal, the main resources that were powering the industrial age, these were very coveted. And that is why certain countries held value as far as being conquered and taken over. A good example of this would be Southeast Asia. Within Southeast Asia, which had once upon a time been colonized by the Dutch, by Arabs, by various European powers, Southeast Asia had plentiful amounts of rubber and tin. And rubber and tin in Southeast Asia, and we're talking like Indonesia, for example, to give you a good example of a country, those regions were extremely resource rich in rubber and tin. And so, as a result of that, European powers wanted to sink their claws into those areas to gather resources for rubber and tin, which are now more coveted in the industrial age than they ever were before. So new times lead to new desires for materials, but there's also still that sort of sense of nationalism, and we had introduced that before the break. Nationalism was driving many countries to want to show off, to want to exert their power, to exert their dominance over various parts of the world. And so there's no doubt that nationalism is going to play a role in the motivations for why people decided to go out and conquer various parts of the world. So I would say those are the two probably biggest causes for imperialism. One, the desire for raw materials, and two, the sense of nationalism to build an empire and to assert your dominance around the world. Has that changed over time? No. The big changes that were, though, where the Europeans were going, and also, like I mentioned before, the desire for new materials. Now, the answer to where the Europeans were going really boils down to Africa. South America had been liberated from Spain, and so South America was sort of untouched as far as the imperialism was concerned. And where the Europeans primarily focused was in Africa. Africa had long been sort of abused by Europeans for the slave trade. And for the last 300 plus years, it wasn't just the Europeans too, because you also had the Arabs, you also had Asians that came to Africa to take part in the Indian Ocean slave trade. But Africa now, big change over time with Africa. Africa is now going to become completely taken over by the European powers, completely taken over. Whereas before, the Europeans primarily went to the coastline and they raided the coast coast of West Africa for slaves, or Indian Ocean trade came to the east, Swahili coast of Africa. Now, the entire continent of Africa is going to come under siege. And the way the Europeans did this is just as cruel as it sounds, because in 1884, in Germany, a conference was held in the capital of Germany, newly unified Germany. Don't forget, Germany became a unified country led by Otto von Bismarck. And Bismarck called a meeting of all the European powers. And in 1884, different European powers came to Germany, and they sat down and carved up Africa on a map. Yes, they drew lines on a map, they slashed, they carved up Africa, and more or less you had various European powers saying, I want this, I want this, I want this, I want this, and they agreed to lay claim to Africa. As grotesque as that sounds, that is exactly what would be the prelude to eventually the European powers taking territories and completely conquering Africa. Africa was annihilated in the 19th century by European powers, completely annihilated. And I'm going to be giving you guys resources and some videos to watch on this throughout next week. But when I say it was completely arrogated, which arrogate means to take something without permission, the African peoples were stunned. I mean, for the first time now, Europeans were going into the interior, the heart of Africa. And with their advanced weaponry, with their industrial might, the African peoples stood very little chance against the Europeans. Although African peoples put up very stiff resistance in certain parts of Africa, especially areas like modern-day Ethiopia, and also areas like South Africa, there was stiff resistance to European colonization there. But for the most part, the continent of Africa was going to be completely taken down, and Europe, after the Berlin Conference, began for about 30 or 40 years knifing and carving up Africa. And with that comes, obviously, one of the great dilemmas in world history is looking at European influence in Africa. Because on one hand, you have millions of lives who are going to be lost due to forced labor, due to wars, due to diseases. But on the other hand, you have European technology and innovation and economies coming into Africa for the first time in full bore. And so there is this sort of complexity to this question of European imperialism in Africa. And it isn't just Africa where this process happens. This happens in Asia. This happens in Southeast Asia. This happens in Central Asia, where the Europeans were fighting against the Ottomans for territory in the Great Game. So throughout the age of imperialism and the age of industry, you really have this sort of complex question of, the Europeans, no doubt, advanced many of the territories that fell under their control by bringing technology, by bringing innovation and engineering and education. However, it came at a steep cost for the indigenous native peoples. And that's where you have to sort of figure out, the cost benefit of all this from a historical standpoint. And that's really an opinion-based question. That's not a fact-based issue. And that's not really up for debate. It's just to get you thinking that you can draw some positives out of this. But the overwhelming reality is that throughout the 19th century, the Europeans became dominant in areas like Africa, Southeast Asia, and later in the week, I'm going to save Asia. We're going to talk about Asia all on its own and look at how Asians responded, especially our two major empires in Asia, which at this time were the Ottomans and the Qing, Qing, the Qing Empire, which was the latest Chinese dynasty that started in the 1600s. The Ottomans and the Qing are going to have a very important response to imperialism, and we'll be discussing how that happened throughout the week. So I hope that this video this morning kind of gave you some supplemental background, some context with the readings that you're doing in the Ways of the World text. Now that we know that we have the online systems raring to go, expect next week to kind of, for things as far as the readings are concerned at home, to be very similar to how we've done it all year. And I will be going over, and I will be creating through Google Classroom as well as Microsoft Teams, a calendar of the meeting times and office hours and all that jazz. So expect a lot of information from me today, Whappers. In the meantime, send emails or even get me on Teams. You can chat me on Teams if you have that system up and running. And we'll be walking through this stuff to make sure that you guys are in great shape. I have no doubt with an entire month of April ahead of us that we can finish this last unit together while still making sure you guys are in great shape for that take-home AP essay, whatever that's going to be. We're still waiting on April 3rd, so at the end of next week, we should have more clarification from the College Board. But in the meantime, this wraps today's ATW on the Intro to Imperialism. I hope you guys have a great rest of the day. Stay healthy. Get outside, work out where you can. Be healthy, but also don't take any risks here unnecessarily. So, and with that, I'll remind you as always how the past shapes the future. Have a great rest of your Thursday, Whappers.